In Gaza, violence is usually measured in airstrikes and casualties, but what is often overlooked is how war operates beyond the battlefield.
The wars are not only military wars. They're wars against culture, they're wars against memory, they're wars against buildings, they are wars against education. So there's all these accumulative wars that are over 100 years old. And the main purpose of it is to silence Palestinians, to erase them, to erase their voice, and to force them to leave.
But wars of this kind do not survive on violence alone. They also depend on how reality is described, repeated, and made acceptable.
Western media is, to a certain extent, complicit in this whole erasure of Palestinians as human beings. And they were complicit from the beginning.
From Lisbon, Frontlines and Backrooms podcast. Your host, Vladimir Bobatik.
In the first episode of this series, we asked how Gaza exposes history, power, and the future. In this episode, we ask a different but equally uncomfortable question: how war is sustained not only through violence, but through knowledge, through what is said, what is omitted, and what is erased. Because destruction does not happen only through bombs. It also happens when lives are reduced to numbers, when history is flattened into headlines, and when an entire people is spoken about, but rarely allowed to speak. My guest today is Dina Matar. She's professor of media and communications at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, director of the Center for Global Media and Communication, and served as chair of the Center for Palestine Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies from 2018 to 2024. Before entering academia, she was a foreign correspondent for Reuters. Her work examines media, power, and Palestine, and the violence done through language itself. Professor Matar, thank you for your time. It is a real pleasure to talk with you today. You write about narrative power over the last couple of years in the last war on Gaza. What would you describe as the dominant meta-narrative in major Western media when treating Gaza, and what assumption did it rest on?
Thank you so much for inviting me. I've written about that, and I think one you're talking about Western legacy media, meaning the mainstream media in the West. The major narrative there has been the narrative of the war, the genocide, as being a war that Israel had to launch in defense of itself. So basically, it's a narrative of the right to defend oneself in terms of, if you think about nation states. But there is another narrative in relation to that, which is the narrative that comes with that, which is the war was also a war against terror. In a sense, this is the other narrative that was the dominant narrative. Hamas conducted a terrorist action inside Israel. So it is reported, and therefore there is a need to try and combat terrorism. And of course, the war on terror is a very strong narrative in the West, because it is tied to particularly September 11th and the consequence of that. And it is tied to, kind of the right of nation states to defend themselves against what is assumed to be terrorist activities. So these, I would say, are the two major narratives that had been played again and again and continued to be used till today to justify the war against Gaza.
Professor, October 7th was a crime, a big crime, but Western legacy media was reacting like everything started on 7th of October. And they are very proud on themselves to put the stories into the context. In this case, they missed the whole context. They missed 100 years of history, 100 years of oppression against Palestinians, Nakba. Gaza was a city, it became a territory because of the refugees. Why they missed all these parts and just started everything from October 7th?
And this is the problem, is that the way that the narrative it is responding to a particular moment, and it kind of ignores a long history before that. But remember, this is not new. The history of the Nakba of 1948 and what happened to the Palestinians is also forgotten. So there's been this kind of silence, which is an imposed silence, in the Western media about the Nakba. And before that, obviously, what Rashid Khalidi has put very correctly in his magnificent book, The 100 Years Against Palestinians. Of course, it's more than a 100 years war. So Israel has been launching since, the Zionist movement has been launching different wars in different ways. The wars are not only military wars. They're wars against culture, they're wars against memory, they're wars against buildings, they are wars against education. So there's all these accumulative wars that are over 100 years old. And the main purpose of it is to silence Palestinians, to erase them, to erase their voice, and to force them to leave. So this all ties to this idea of ethnic cleansing. Now, why? The question is, why do Western media continue to do this? We have different issues here at play. One is, of course, geopolitical considerations and so on. Israel has always had a special place in the Western world. As, kind of talking the narrative around Israel is that it's the only democracy in the Middle East. So basically, this is a narrative that is also promoted by Israeli leaders. And remember, journalism works in particular ways where it gets what is presumed to be the narrative and the discourse of so-called legitimate sources. And oftentimes, these legitimate sources, particularly in this context, have always been Israeli voices. So Israeli voices from the beginning, pushed that narrative that has continued to play to today. And the Israeli narrative, the Zionist narrative, of course, does not want to talk about their own crimes and their own, their own wars against the Palestinians. They don't want to talk about the history. They don't want to kind of open the space for an argument to say, well, actually, the Palestinians do exist and they have the right to the land as well. The other point that we have to remember is that Israel has one of the most sophisticated propaganda machines and practices in the whole world. But even if we, talk about it more broadly, they have, as part of their strategies of, military strategies, political strategies, they also have a very sophisticated political communication strategy. And in this strategy, they use, propaganda, kind of tools. And the propaganda tools are not just, they're about controlling the narrative. They're now with the age of artificial intelligence, it's about making sure that they control the algorithm and that, other algorithms that provide other stories are censored and so on. So they do have access to the technology to be able to do that. And before that, they had the access to kind of the cultural spaces where they could, kind of produce and reproduce and disseminate their own story about themselves. It is worth reading Ilan Papp's book, The Idea of Israel, where he talks of how Israel promoted a vision of itself, an idea, an imagination of itself as being, a place of social justice, of democracy, of, human rights and so on. And it promoted that by kind of ensuring that it had control of, cultural production in the West. So there were a lot of films, there were a lot of programs and so on. And these played a big role in kind of enhancing its political communication strategy. And it's very strange. I mean, you might want, during the war, during the genocide, we were actually noticing a lot of things that Israel also did. One of them was what we call the distraction strategy, where the focus would be on the number of children killed and maimed, and the number of families forced out of their home, becoming refugees, and so on. So it's the actual human side of the narrative. And whenever that started to play in the Western press, you had a distraction happening. So one of the main distractions I remember at the beginning was this whole business against UNRWA, that UNRWA is also an organization that has Hamas members and so on and so forth. And the press, sadly, became very much concerned with that. And again, this is part of the distraction. One example of distraction strategies that Israel used.
You had a couple of interesting observations in your previous answer, like media doesn't want to talk about history, especially in the news program, and that is true. Sometimes they don't have a time. But there is another thing. On the 7th of October, and after the attack at Bondi Beach, in a matter of hours, we knew who are the victims. We had interviews with the families. We knew what was the character of the victims. After Bondi Beach, we knew that one of the victims was a 10-year-old girl, and one was a Holocaust survivor. And for Palestinians, in this last war on Gaza, it took so much time to become a human beings that are killed on daily basis, not to become victims, just human beings. Why they are treated in this way? Why this type of behavior of Western legacy media?
Well, because Western media is, to a certain extent, complicit in this whole erasure of Palestinians as human beings. And they were complicit from the beginning. And I did write a journal article, an academic journal article about that, which is the role of Western legacy media in what we call epistemic violence, which is the violence against knowledge production. And you could even argue that it's a sort of anti-Palestinian racism that is also has been also evident. So let us go back to your question about the concentration on the human dynamics of the victims of October 7th, and taking huge numbers of days, large, before they started talking about the stories of the Palestinian victims. And we also see that more recently in the coverage, in the Western media coverage of the very sad affair, the Bondi affair in Australia. So there was, these, all of a sudden we hear stories about these people, their lives, everything. And it is very, very disturbing, because you rarely hear that about the Palestinians. We also heard a lot about Ukrainian families and so on and so forth. So that, if you kind of collect the evidence, and there is empirical evidence, and people are beginning to write about it in journals and so on, but these are academic journals, there's empirical evidence to show that there is a bias against the Palestinians. And that this bias transfers or shows itself in the kind of the silences around what happens to Palestinians. What happens? Who are the children? What kind of what are the stories? Who are the families? Who are the women? We never hear that. We never hear a kind of a whole story around them. So I agree with you. There is this terrible, kind of imbalance. There is no, the BBC and other Western media pride themselves on being impartial. That, it really is a joke. It's a joke because, so you want to ask me why. There are two issues. One is, first of all, the politics, political ties. And secondly, there is this new big, kind of ideology that is taking form and shape and becoming powerful, which is the anti-Semitism. The kind of linking any type of pro-Palestinian narrative, even in the mildest form, to talk about Palestinians as being human beings like any other human beings, as being have had a long history of oppression, that they are subjected to incredible cruelty in the prisons, in the West Bank. It's really awful. We don't hear much about that. It's just life is very difficult for people living there. It's also difficult for Palestinians in the diaspora, because you cannot go back. You're tied. You're also silenced in different ways. So this ideology of anti-Semitism is also promoted by Israel's propaganda machine, because they wanted to be there. They want to ensure that they can wave the baton and say, you are anti-Semitic, and we accuse you of anti-Semitism, and then this again becomes another distraction in their political communication strategy. It's always been a distraction, but it has been used particularly since the genocide began. It has been used to try and silence people more, and kind of put the fear in them so they can't do anything. And we see that on in campuses. We see there is a lot of suppression, a lot of censorship in the United States in particular. So you have a problem around this freedom of expression, because freedom of expression is not really kind of available to everyone. Not everyone has the right to freedom of expression. I would argue that Palestinians have been denied that right for a very long time.
You mentioned one very interesting and important thing in your previous answer, and that is silencing university campuses. If we came to the situation that we are not free to speak up our mind and have a conversation and debate at universities, where we are heading as a societies? You know better than me that if you say from the river to the sea, most probably in UK you are going to be arrested. So where are we at this point in time, and where we are heading?
Yeah, I think this is a bigger question than I could answer right now. But I think there is a need to continue with the talking and with the discussions. I don't know whether you have. I've got on my desk this brilliant book by Omar al-Aqad, a Palestinian journalist, writer, brilliant author, and intellectual in Canada. And the book is called "One Day Everyone Will Always Have Been Against This." And he talks about this, the censorship, the self-censorship, the inability to speak out because you're worried about losing your job. But also he talks about, the problems with Western media. And I think one of the issues is that we do have, our students are amazing. Students, the new generation of students. So we have to remember that alongside all this miserable kind of narrative and the continued suppression of the Palestinians, we will need to notice that there is a global solidarity movement, and the issue is to try and talk about Palestine in conjunction with other global issues like Black lives, LGBTQ plus and so on, and other issues that matter to the whole world. So, and think about it in terms of, these are all movements that band together against racism against racism, discrimination, against censorship in any form. And so we have to build on that, and there are ways of trying to get around the kind of, okay, you cannot talk about this or you can talk about this, and students are amazing. They come up with really brilliant strategies. And this is very interesting. I'm old enough to remember the 1970s and, the kind of the 60s and 70s, the anti-colonial movements then, and the global push behind them. And then again, South Africa is a very good example, the end of apartheid, and trying to think of possibilities of overcoming, this very incredibly dark period in our lives.
Western coverage often falls on the both sides frame. They have that mantra that they need to have both sides. So how did that framing obscure asymmetry, occupation, international law, and the scale of violence in Gaza? And let's not forget West Bank as well.
Okay, so it works in different ways. So I used to work with a Western news agency, and of course, this idea of having the balance, one voice from one side, then you have to have another voice from another side. It works in situations where, you have, as you mentioned, symmetrical power relations, or symmetrical power configurations. It doesn't work when you have asymmetrical power relations. There is always a problem with this thing. I mean, so if you kind of pay attention to the coverage, you'll have like a slippage of some words. For example, at the beginning of, maybe in the first year of the genocide, we had the BBC, for example, bringing someone, like from a senior politician, military leader from Israel, and then they would bring, let us say, a Palestinian voice that they considered to be legitimate, and then they would really begin the discussion, and you would find that in many cases, the Palestinian would be kind of shut down, or perhaps not allowed to speak as ever they want, because the questions become very difficult questions. They're always about, okay, so why cannot you condemn Hamas? Why cannot you say that Hamas is a terrorist organization? So the questioning. So when they bring, even let us say, okay, they are balanced. They have brought in two different voices, and each one is saying, but the question becomes very focused on, well, before you can say anything, you have to start with a condemnation. And so this is another form of silencing, and lack of giving the same space to the dual forces. Secondly, there's never a mention of this idea of asymmetrical power. Israel is the most powerful military force in the Middle East, and we've seen how it went and attacked Lebanon, Iran, Syria, Yemen, without anyone saying anything. It was reported as though it was just news. But this is the problem, is that the asymmetrical element of the conflict was never reported. And this is something that we need to keep talking about. So one of the things going forward is that, journalists themselves have to become critical of their own practice. The practice is very, it's not, I cannot use the word fair, but it's not a good practice. What is this journalism that is supposedly about social justice and about, holding governments accountable and about mobilizing behind the good forces in nature, if it doesn't do the basic things? So it's a problem. It's been doing the right thing, maybe in Ukraine, but it hasn't ever done the right thing in Palestine. The Nakba has been silenced. Very little reporting of the Nakba. Like, these people became refugees because they just became refugees. So the history of why Gaza is Gaza, why Gaza has been under occupation for more than 17 years by Israel, the history of Gaza, witnessing and being subjected to different wars, that isn't talked about. It isn't mentioned that this is like war number 6, I think, or against Gaza since 2007. So, and even before that. So there is a need for journalists to really look at itself, and wonder about its potential. Is it really doing the job properly? Should journalists be proud of themselves? There are other factors that we have to remember. Israel has controlled the information field. It's not only trying to control the narrative, but they are all connected. So how did it do that? First of all, it cuts down the internet when it wants to cut it down, shutting down all communication. Secondly, it hasn't allowed the free access of international journalists into Gaza. So we only have the very brave reporting by these very brave Palestinian journalists and content creators. And number 3 is the targeted killing of Palestinian journalists. So how, controlling the information field. So again, you have someone like Jeremy Bowen, for example, placed in Jerusalem and reporting from there. I mean, he doesn't have access. And then if he speaks to Palestinian, let us say, reporters on the ground, he would be careful. He would say, these are Palestinians on the ground, and maybe they are Hamas members, or maybe, and so it is. Journalists really have to, start the movement themselves. It is not okay for journalists to say that we are journalists and we are reporting on this and that, and then not being true to the profession or its potential.
You mentioned Palestinian journalists reporting from Gaza. More than 200 of them were killed. Some of them, before they were killed, were also victims of smear campaign from Israel, calling those journalists Hamas sympathizers or members of Hamas. And Western legacy media would pick up this narrative. More journalists were killed in Gaza than in all wars since Second World War combined. Somehow we are missing clear condemnation of those crimes and the death of those journalists in Western media. Why?
It's not only the journalists. It's like these also brave content creators. It's the artists. It's the scholars, the poets. Of course, we know of the famous poet El-Arir, and there are many others. So it's again, where is the reaction to that? We know why Israel is doing it. It's trying to stop them speaking. It's trying to control knowledge production. It's trying to silence and erase Palestinians. So it's doing it that way. And it's really a shame and a shameful thing that journalists in the West and elsewhere haven't come together to say, we condemn this. We're going on strike for one day. Why don't they do? Yeah, I mean, that would have been such a great symbolic, powerful gesture. And it would also, kind of draw attention to what Israel is doing. But no, they continue doing their work. They don't even put out any statements. But we also have a problem in the field of media studies, which of course I'm in. Again, we have put out petitions and so on, saying we really need a statement condemning the attacks against knowledge production and against media institutions. I mean, we are analyzing, we are critical scholars working on how media functions in society, the relationship between media and politics and so on, and the question of media power. And they refused. So there is this, kind of at the moment, we're still in that moment. We hopefully are going to get out of it, as I said, through this global solidarity movement, and continuing to speak out. But we are in a moment that is very bleak for, for human rights, for international law, for politics. What is politics? Uh, Again, the question of freedom of expression, and importantly, journalism. Journalism has somehow really shot itself in the foot, or disgraced itself with the lack of action, with the lack of voices coming together to say, come on, 238 of journalists, whoever they are, they are journalists after all, whether they are sympathizers or not, they have been killed. Why is that allowed to happen?
Professor, we need to talk about language. When Western legacy media is talking about Israeli victims, they use emotive language and words like massacre, slaughter, brutal murder, and atrocity. For Palestinians, they use passive language and words like dead or having lost their lives, which obscures the perpetrator, whereas Israelis are often described as being killed or murdered. Israeli military actions are often framed as self-defense or precision strikes, while Palestinian actions are generally framed as aggression or unprovoked. How this type of the language shape what audiences think it is happening, and how much this approach is important?
It is very important. So, this is what we call the framing. How do you frame?
Mhm.
And how do you frame a narrative? What are the frames? So, and the frames are obviously the language used, and to describe particular events. So, if you say, Palestinians were killed, or 5 Palestinians were killed, it's different than saying Israel killed 5 Palestinians. Okay, so we're always, and you can look at that, and you can find consistently evidence of the Western media saying 5 Palestinians were killed, without saying Israel killed 5 Palestinians. So in a sense, using the passive, which is Palestinians were killed, okay, they might have been killed by a truck or something. But when you say Israel killed, this is an active framing, which puts the blame on Israel. But so framing matters. Framing is a way for people, audiences, ordinary people, when they hear the story, when they when they see the report, the framing makes the audiences think about issues in a particular way. So, the audience would, someone living, let's just say, in Birmingham, and he has listened to the story, has no idea, it's being framed as 5 Palestinians were killed. So framing matters because it does provide an explanation, a form of interpretation of what's happening out there. That becomes discourse. It becomes like something that is very difficult to shift, because this is the interpretation. So again, as you have mentioned very rightly, there's no context, there's no kind of history and so on. So the framing of the event as being, well, it's a response to October the 7th. It is an interpretation that becomes accepted as being the truth. This is what happened, and it continues to be there. So again, let us think another frame, which is the war on terror frame. The repetition of that frame means that it provides an interpretive framework, a way of explaining events very far away in a very simplistic way that people can understand. Because the war on terror, oh wow, people know about September 11th. They know about the fight against ISIS and Al Qaeda and other Islamic groups. So it is it becomes set in people's mind. So, and again, for us working in this field, we have empirical evidence. We look at, let us say, of 20 days or 30 days of coverage, and we look at what are the frames that are used. And you'll find that in this particular case, the frames were frames that showed or reflected a particular way of understanding. So there is an intention. A frame is intentional. So you cannot say that a journalist used it without that. They might have used it because it's very simple. It's a simple frame. Everybody understands it. But you have to think about the intention of the frame. And the intention of the frame is to simplify whatever is happening, and for people to, but also to give it meaning that resonates with how people normally understands these issues. So yeah, frames are so important.
Let's talk about the casualty figures, because this is very important. Palestinian victims are usually presented in numbers, and that is important if it is in the context of explaining the vastness of crimes. And that is the rare case in Western legacy media. How that degradation to statistics helped dehumanize Palestinians further?
It's a very good question, and I haven't thought about it, kind of critically the way that you wanted me to answer. But of course, when you have numbers, you're not mentioning the names, you're not mentioning the ages, you're not mentioning their gender. You are, numbers are numbers. They don't mean anything. And so basically, it is a form of dehumanization because they are reduced to statistics. They are not talked about as human beings who had a life, who had a history, who have children, who have brothers, sisters, parents, and so on. And so I think it's a very good way of thinking about it. But yeah, I mean, it is almost without saying that it is a form of statistical dehumanization that goes along with other forms of dehumanization that we have seen. And some people have called this type of dehumanization, and I agree with that. It's a form of anti-Palestinian racism. And that is, I think, it is important to begin using that type of language like in everyday, because again, it's a frame that we can use to try and change the narrative and to make people realize that what has happened is just has not happened before. It's the first live streamed genocide. But its effect is the total destruction of the place, the killing, the killing of whole families together, and not not being able to have a record. So I was reading this week that Palestinians in Gaza are now going through the grim process of kind of trying to find their missed relatives by digging up the land and so on. So it's a very gruesome thing, and to see where they are. Again, that would be something, as a journalist, it would be something that would be an interesting story to go and speak to them, or, find someone who can speak to them and tell their story, about their struggle, living 2 years without knowing where the bodies were, and then, constructing a story that is about their lives, rehumanizing the Palestinians. That would be but we haven't seen anything about that.
When the Holocaust happened, we needed decades to understand and process the scope of the crime and to understand what genocide really means. In Srebrenica, it was a matter of months, maybe a year maximum. Gaza, as you mentioned, is genocide broadcasted live on social media. In that sense, how much the social media actually helped for the public to shift into the right direction and to say, okay, legacy media, you're not telling us the whole truth?
It's been amazing. I think, sort of the way that, Palestinians in Gaza have used social media to tell their stories, to report, to record, to talk about their experiences, to show that they are like everyone else. It has been incredible, kind of way. Social media has been incredible that way. Um, but we also know that there is the censorship by social media platforms like Facebook. They kind of shut down kind of pages that they see as being pro-Palestinian, or they see as being anti-Semitic, in other words. And so it is something, we really need to study it. We need to think of, the questions to be raised. It's how Palestinians under genocide have managed, under genocide and the breakdown of communications, Israel's shutting down the internet, they have still managed to, kind of use their mobile phones, very, very simple way of using mobile phones to publicize their story, breaking through Israel's digital occupation. And it's really worth reading a bit more around about what Israel's digital occupation. Occupation is not only on the ground; it's also digital. They censor, they stop, they target people using social media. But the creativity and the creative practices are really worth studying more. I'm working currently on a paper on the Gazan creative content creators. These are not journalists. Many of them have not trained as journalists, but they are actually practicing journalism under war in challenging circumstances. So you probably know about, there are some, I'm not speaking about the famous ones like Bisan and Plestia and so on. But these are really worth looking for and seeing what they have done. Their work will be important for anyone who is studying journalism for the future to look at what they did.
When the major media outlets get the facts wrong, there is no correction or often very minimal. So, what would meaningful accountability actually look like in a conflict reporting in general? And do you think that in the future there is going to be a time when the people who are working in legacy media today will have a self-reflection and recognize, not to public but to themselves, we were supporting genocide or we helped genocide to happen?
I don't know. I mean, I think it is worth reading this book. One day, everyone will have always been against it because it does have a critique of Western legacy media. Will they ever go and kind of say they have been wrong? I doubt it, because as you know, journalism is a kind of it's about the moment. It might be some people would be courageous enough to say, I'm going to write a critique, and I'm going to do this. We might see some people like that. But I think people will be worried about their jobs, about, their place in society, and so on and so forth, before they can do that. So what is accountability? A really important question, because if you think about journalism role in society, one of them is to hold government accountable. But I think that one of the other questions that needs to be asked, and maybe rethink what journalism should be, is to hold ourselves accountable, is to hold journalism accountable itself. Because it has been, particularly in the coverage of this war, it has really acted as a propaganda tool for Israel, and it has shown itself to, or people working in journalism have shown themselves to be allied with the power. Noam Chomsky and Herman wrote their important book of the propaganda called Manufacturing Consent around the Vietnam War. And this, and it has been criticized, no, there's no, the idea that journalism and power elite work together. That's kind of the debate that had been going on. This has been critiqued. No, journalists are, independent. They have their own opinion and so on. But this genocide has shown that the propaganda model still continues to be irrelevant. And so we might want to think about that, and that might be a way for rethinking accountability and rethinking this kind of Western model of journalism that keeps kind of reducing the practice to almost nothing. Very few people now follow legacy media. People go to their own platforms, they follow the people that they like and so on, which is a problem in itself because, of the echo chambers and the problems associated with that.
Professor, if somebody gives you opportunity to have a newsroom for one day with a short checklist, let's say with language, sourcing, context, voices, what are the first things that you would implement over there in the newsroom? What would be the first thing to tell them?
Well, very difficult question. I don't know, to be honest. I think the first thing would be to change the sourcing. The relationship between news sources and journalism has always been a relationship of legitimacy and credibility and so on. So I would suggest that people go to ordinary people and take the microphone and the camera and say, okay, tell us, about your experiences of, let us say, the genocide. How it doesn't have to be with Palestinians. It can be ordinary people in the UK, let us say, go and say, talk to us about it. And this will be, I think, it will be a very fascinating exercise. And it might show that people are thinking outside the box, but it might also show that they have been co-opted in the media framing. So in a way, it's a way of using the opportunity to speak to ordinary people to look back at the profession and think about what do we need to change. So that's what I would do. I mean, it's like asking me to go and but I think it'll be fun. Can you imagine how fun it will be to do something like that?
What is the long-term cost of all of this for the journalism in global and our shared morals? You already said that the people are not watching legacy media too much. They're sourcing themselves from YouTube or other social media. Is this going to be the only consequence, or you think it is going to be much broader?
I really don't know. I think it will take time. It's not going to be in my lifetime, but I guess it will take time for the new generation to think about a new language. One of the issues of the media is the naming. How do they name? It's not only the frame; it's naming. How do they name particular conflicts in various parts of the world? Naming matters. So if you think of a very simple example of naming and its legacy is the naming of the Middle East as the Middle East. Now, the naming is a colonial naming. It doesn't mean that there is a Middle East between Asia and the West. but it is a name that had been put across and used by colonial powers. So, in a sense, thinking about that. So, how do we, first of all, have this new generation think of unnaming, of unframing, of a new language of humanity that we could use? And I think it's going to take some time, because there is now a lot of disillusionment with human rights, with the language of human rights, with the potential of international law, with the potential of politics as being emancipatory, as being about giving equal opportunities to everyone, and so on. So, and the new language should be related to new practices. So where are these practices going to be, in a sense? So it's a language. Maybe the language should be the language of solidarity. That might become the language of future generations, that will turn against what we have been subjected to for a very long time. So the idea of unnaming. So in my classes, I had, we do talk about this quite a lot. So how can we look at different ways of seeing the world and understanding the world, particularly in the global south, sort of how, going to ordinary people and, making them talk about their experiences and lives. And through that type of, kind of interaction, we might be able to come up with new language that can speak back to the naming and the framing and the the discourse and the propaganda of the most important powers in the world right now, including the media.
Professor, you're a Palestinian. Obviously, Palestinians, like every other people in the world, are different in many ways. Some are very educated, some are not. People are often forgotten that we have Palestinians who are Muslims and who are Christians as well. How do you see this imposing that all Palestinians are the same? That all of them are supporters of Hamas? That if you are not capable or you don't want to condemn Hamas, you're Hamas member. If you're not capable or you don't want to say that 7th of October was a terrorist attack, you're a terrorist as well. Why this type of generalization is reserved exclusively for Palestinians to put them into one dimension?
And this is, the issue that we talked about, which is part of the anti-Palestinian racism. And what we have to do is to speak against it in different ways. So yes, there are different Palestinians, and we do have a huge amount of production by Palestinians. And we have books, we have artwork, we have music, we have um, um, poetry, and through that will work, together. It will work to change the narrative, but it will take time. And so again, if you're asking me why are Palestinians, yeah. So w- another book that maybe you should read is the book by Muhammad al-Kurd, Imperfect Victims. So why is it that we as Palestinians are confronted with this problem? And if my first book was called What It Means to Be Palestinian. And, being Palestinian in the West, you begin to think about it, you're always worried about what people think about you or what they are going to say. And we have to be strong enough to stand against this and just say, look, we're like you. We're like everyone else. We're not different. We have lives, we have families, we have times of happiness, we enjoy things, and there are times when we are sad, we are unhappy, and so on. But it's just trying. It's um, it's overturning this whole narrative. It's quite a challenging one, but it can be done by joining forces together again with other global movements that are also seeking their emancipation and their recognition in society. So what we need is to work on this concept and the right to be recognized. So that's all. Beginning to work on that, and also, we Palestinians have to come together. We have had a problem with our leadership. We have problems with, kind of what is more important than the other. So we just need to, perhaps think about coming together behind um, a proposition that would make our lives better.
All this time we are talking about Western legacy media and Western public, but for me, it is a striking difference between how this last war on Gaza and everything that is happening in the West Bank was seen in Western public, where we had outrage and sympathy, and in most Arab countries, political silence. Public in those countries is touched, but politicians not much to be forced into reaction. Sometimes I have a feeling that outrage is bigger in the Western public. Am I wrong about this?
You are not wrong. Absolutely. It's a problem in the Arab world, and we have been talking about it, is that the silence by governments and by the Arab people has been very deafening, has been very, very difficult to cope with. But it is expected. I mean, it is expected because, these people are living under very difficult conditions, authoritarian conditions. They are being, they have their own problems in terms of cost of living, finding jobs, and so on. And again, they are filled with their own propaganda systems, which really make them, think about something else. So they're busy doing their big festivals, their achievements, and building new cities and so on. So we know that the Arab world, um, I would want to say very clearly, has somehow not lived up to our expectations. Um, you know, but we understand that they are under some type of oppression themselves. So it's understandable. But it is, as you said, the lack of action is very evident. But then you have to, on the other hand, these people see what Israel can do, and can go and attack Lebanon, and do whatever it wants, attack Syria, do whatever it wants, attack, even cause problems with Turkey, and cause problems in Yemen and elsewhere. So people are aware of that, and they are aware. They know that as long as Israel is supported by the US, um, nothing is going to change. The change has to come. The change has to happen in the West. The change has to happen amongst the populations who see their government supporting Israel as a genocidal actor. And so hopefully that will happen. But we have to think about that relationship as well, and how it causes much more complex situations uh, than expected.
Professor, this question is for you as a Palestinian. What kind of the impact this last war on Gaza had on you, as well as the violence in the West Bank and the continuous occupation of West Bank, the devastation, losing the territory in a thin air day by day, little by little? What keeps you moving? Is that hope for peace, statehood, your students? Do you think something is going to change?
I hope so. I mean, you're absolutely right. It has been a devastating 2 years on every Palestinian. Devastating because we were at a period where we thought, oh, maybe we're going to get to a position where we are going to be accepted in the world as everyone else. But then the genocide happened, and, despite the fact that, we kept talking against it and so on, it kind of can cause you to be very frustrated and very deflated and, kind of depressed about it all. But and there were moments when, you stop being able to say much or do much, because you kind of sit there and say, well, I've been silenced, but you have to keep fighting that urge to be silent. And so I think we need to keep going. We need to keep showing support for Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, occupied territories, to continue to do whatever we can, whatever little we can, so that they can continue, because they are living under very, very difficult conditions. And so we just have to support them. We can do that by, maybe supporting some students to finish their education, maybe giving some support to medical aid, helping rebuild and so on. But, the more we get people together to do that, the better chance we have to kind of torpedo that crazy plan by Trump to take over Gaza, by Trump and Israel. So we've just got to keep going.
Professor Matar, thank you so much for this conversation and for your time. This was a conversation with Professor Dina Matar. The next episode of Frontlines and Backrooms is released on January 11th. Until then, listen to Frontlines and Backrooms Brief every Friday from 8 p.m. GMT. Before the interviews, before the debates, Frontlines and Backrooms Brief gives you the context.